Most people often associate Canada, and rightfully so, with the British Empire and Commonwealth. However, it is extremely important to note that Canada is an incredibly diverse country and contains a multitude of people. Perhaps the most notable one is the people of Quebec, a mainly French-speaking province whose people largely descend from French settlers who arrived in North America before the British gained control. Interestingly, the people of Quebec have been able to preserve their francophone culture for centuries, despite the arrival of immigrants from around the world. This was encouraged by the British, who passed the Quebec Act in the late 18th century to prevent revolt by allowing the French to practice many of their customs, as well as their Catholic religion, which played a large part in keeping the francophone population unified. Although this allowed the survival of the unique culture, this also led to there being continual conflicts between the Quebecois and their Anglophone neighbors, as cultural differences meant that they often disagreed on important issues. A notable example would be the Lower Canada Rebellion of the 1840s, which was caused by a desire for Francophone citizens of British Canada who lived in Lower Canada to gain more freedom from the Anglophones, which were in power, who lived in Upper Canada. These conflicts would continue into the 20th century, as in 1917, the Canadian government tried to implement conscription to help the war effort in World War I. While this was supported by many Anglophone Canadians who felt a strong connection to the British Empire, Francophone Canadians did not have such loyalties to any European nation and thus were strongly opposed to conscription. This culminated in rioting by the Quebecois. Thus, it is extremely clear that the nature of Francophone society in Canada, and Quebec as a whole, caused many conflicts. Even so, for the most part, these conflicts were quelled and the nation stayed unified. However, in the second half of the 20th century, a movement would begin which aimed to finally see Quebec become independent from Canada, and the people behind that movement were willing to go to any means to make that happen. Fueled by extremism and violence, it would represent the most serious attempt for Quebec independence. This is the story of the October Crisis. To understand the October Crisis, some context is in order. From 1944 to 1960, Quebec was ruled by the conservative Catholic Union Nationale Party, which, under the leadership of Duplessis, used anti-communism as an excuse to suppress unions, strengthened the power of the Catholic Church in society while reducing the governments, and benefited the Anglophone elite. However, by 1960 the winds of change were blowing, and Union Nationale was ousted from power by the Liberal Party, led by Jean Lesage. The Liberals reversed many of the earlier policies by expanding government action in society and dramatically reduced the power of the Catholic Church. Under the policy of Maître Chenu, the government promoted the rights and welfare of the Francophone citizens instead, rather than the Anglophone elites that Union Nationale had. This radical change in politics and society would be known as the Quiet Revolution. This change and increased empowerment of Francophone citizens naturally led to the rise of nationalism, as the new policies emphasized the protection of the Francophone population. Thus, the 1960s would result in many concerted efforts to achieve Quebec's independence. While many, such as René Lévesque, attempted to conduct this peacefully, there were also many people who were willing and eager to use violence as a means for the same goal. One such group was the FLQ, or Front de Libération du Québec, founded in 1963 by two Quebecois. The group advocated for the use of violent attacks to achieve secession and create an ideal Marxist ethno-state. The group took much inspiration from other revolutionary groups across the world, especially in anti-colonial struggles, as they considered themselves to be in a similar situation. They tried to appeal to French culture and history in order to gain support. The unfortunate events that would lead directly to the October Crisis began years before, in the same year as the FLQ's founding. In the spring of 1963, the FLQ began a bombing campaign, placing explosives within mailboxes near Canadian Army installations around Montreal. However, the perpetrators were caught and sentenced that same year. This only escalated in the following year. In August, a faction of the FLQ attempted to rob a gun store, but this failed, and two people were shot dead, while two other perpetrators were sentenced to be hanged. In the following years, the FLQ expanded its political scope by siding with the lower, mainly francophone classes, by violently attacking corporations involved in labor struggle. Around this time, nationalists in Quebec were also emboldened by the support of French President Charles de Gaulle. Attacks would continue throughout the decade, with a major bombing occurring in early 1969 at the Montreal Stock Exchange. In that year, two branches would also form, the Chenier Cell and the Liberation Cell, both based in Montreal. Whereas the Liberation Cell was more calculating and strategic, the Chenier Cell was, by contrast, more violent and uncompromising. By the end of the decade, almost 24 FLQ members would be in federal custody. It was then, in 1970, when the FLQ planned their most ambitious attack yet. What would come to be known as the October Crisis started, unsurprisingly, in October. On the 5th, the Liberation Cell kidnapped veteran diplomat James Cross, who represented the UK. For his release, they demanded the release of over 20 FLQ members who had been locked up for their crimes, which they referred to as political prisoners. They also demanded that the CBC aired their manifesto on the radio, which would happen in the following days. On October 10th, the Chenier Cell would kidnap Pierre Laporte, the Minister of Labour for Quebec, off his front lawn. Seeing this rise in danger and violence, the Canadian Army would be sent in on the 12th in order to maintain peace and protect federal property. Despite this action seeming like a sort of invasion, most Quebecois were actually quite supportive of this decision. The following day, with tensions mounting after the arrival of the army, the liberal and charismatic Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau would be interviewed about the crisis. When the interviewer asked him how far he was willing to go in order to maintain peace and stability, he said,
"Just watch me."
On the 15th, a large rally in support of the FLQ happened. This heightened tensions, as people outside of Quebec became wary that it may be a prelude to a rebellion. On the 16th, at 4 a.m., Pierre Trudeau enacted the War Measures Act for the third time in Canadian history and the first time in peacetime, suspending habeas corpus. The enactment of the act would also allow the police to conduct over 1,600 raids and arrest almost 500 people with little evidence in the coming weeks. A day later, Pierre Laporte was killed by the Chenier Cell. On the same day, James Cross's kidnappers proclaimed that Cross would not be executed unless the police attempted to rescue him. Their full list of demands included gold, safe transport to a foreign-friendly nation, and giving postal workers who had been laid off their jobs back. 3 weeks later, on November 9th, the Chenier Cell would be raided and one kidnapper would be captured. The crisis would come to an end soon after, when on December 3rd, James Cross was finally released. The FLQ members only got transportation to Cuba. By late December, the troops had begun to withdraw from Quebec. The rest of the Chenier Cell would be captured before the end of the year. The crisis was also resolved with relatively few deaths, with only 2 people being killed, Pierre Laporte and a Canadian soldier who died in an accident. The most controversial issue of the October crisis was the usage of the War Powers Act by Trudeau. Due to the abilities granted to the government by the act, hundreds of people were arrested by the police simply for being suspected of having FLQ sympathies. Despite this, a large majority of both Francophone and Anglophone citizens supported using the War Powers Act to maintain stability at the time. The October crisis also led to a sharp decrease in support for the FLQ, which up until that point had been steadily gaining support throughout the decade. However, because of the way the crisis was handled, they began to start supporting more peaceful routes to independence, mostly through political participation. By 1971, the FLQ would cease to exist. The October crisis also marked a turning point in the role of the Canadian Armed Forces. In the immediate years after the Second World War, the Canadian Army was intended, much like other NATO countries, to be a bulwark against communist aggression in Europe, but once Pierre Trudeau took power, he began to transition it to be more of an internal police force. Thus, when he deployed the troops to quash an internal rebellion and provide stability, he was demonstrating his new ideology regarding the armed forces. The crisis also had a direct impact on the RCMP, or the Canadian Police, as it soon came to light that they had committed some illegal activities after the humiliation of failing to stop the October crisis. This would lead to the creation of the CSIS, essentially the Canadian CIA, whose role had been under the RCMP prior to its founding in 1984. Additionally, Judge MacLeod, who oversaw the commission that investigated the RCMP, also advocated many changes which would limit the government and the Prime Minister's ability to override the rights of citizens, but these recommendations would not pass. In many ways, the October crisis was simply one in a long line of revolutionary events which occurred during the era of decolonization during the latter half of the 20th century, but in other ways the crisis was also extremely unique. On one hand, the FLQ was inspired by liberation movements in other parts of the world, and many of their tactics were obviously based on other revolutionary movements. For example, the bombings and kidnappings within cities were reminiscent of the Provisional IRA in Northern Ireland, who were fighting a similar struggle. In that sense, the FLQ was very similar to other movements, and thus can be seen as just another example of the prevailing attitudes of liberation during the time, where many other nations broke free of their colonial shackles. However, on the other hand, the FLQ's circumstances were also extremely unique. For one, they were operating within a first world developed nation, unlike many other movements, which often gained support by rallying the citizens of exploited colonies. This meant that their messaging and ideology had to appeal to a different group of people, and thus their focus was more on cultural issues rather than economic ones, even if they were Marxists. They were also comparatively less violent, killing less than 10 people throughout their campaign, which lasted a decade, whereas the IRA, for example, killed hundreds. Finally, they also blended nationalism and communism, which in many cases, such as during the Spanish Civil War, often operated on different sides of the political spectrum, making it a unique group with a very specific goal, which differed from traditional political thinking. Either way, the FLQ failed in its objective. In the end, the cause which they spent over a decade fighting for would never succeed, and today Quebec remains a large and important part of the nation of Canada. However, even though Quebec never became independent, the preservation of many Quebecois cultural elements, such as the French language, was guaranteed when the Constitution Act, one of the most important pieces of legislation in Canadian history, was passed by Trudeau in 1982, in large part to prevent the Quebecois from trying to succeed again. Thus, even though they did not fully achieve their goal, the FLQ helped the Quebecois population gain rights and concessions from the government, and these concessions continue to protect the people and culture of Quebec today.